My boss signed my termination letter laughing, but when he read the fine print, he fainted. Sarah Miller walked into the luxurious office carrying the yellow envelope, her hands trembling as Christopher Sterling humiliated her for the 10th time that week. He grabbed the papers, laughing loudly, saying he'd finally get rid of the incompetent woman who dared to question his orders. "Finally," Christopher exclaimed, adjusting his glasses with a cruel smile. 22 years of putting up with your nonsense, Sarah. I should have done this a long time ago." Sarah remained silent, watching his every move. The 53-year-old man, grey hair combed back, wore his most expensive navy blue suit. His pudgy hands held the gold pen as if it were a trophy. "You know what amuses me most?" he continued, flipping through the pages without reading them. "You think you can get another job at your age? 45 years old, no college degree, no experience at other companies. Who's going to want you?" The Human Resources Secretary, Martha Cooper, was present as a witness. She avoided looking directly at Sarah, embarrassed by the situation. At 62 years old, Martha had witnessed countless scenes like this throughout her career. Christopher signed the first page with disdain, his laughter echoing through the room. He turned to the second page, continuing to sign without bothering to read the content. The third page received the same treatment. "Done," he announced, slamming the pen on the desk. "Now get out of my sight and—" That's when his eyes fixed on a specific line in the fine print of the last page. The smile vanished instantly from his face. His hands began to tremble as he read and reread that passage. What is this?" he muttered, his voice faltering. Sarah took a step forward, her posture completely changing. The submissive woman from seconds ago had been replaced by someone confident and determined. "Tell us exactly what you just signed, Mr. Christopher," she said calmly. "A termination document with a few special clauses." Christopher's face lost all its color. He tried to get up from the leather chair, but his legs gave way. The document trembled in his hands as he tried to comprehend what he had just done. This can't be legal," he stammered, sweat beginning to form droplets on his forehead. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down calmly in front of the desk, something she had never done in all those years. Martha watched the scene with wide eyes, still trying to process what was happening. "You know, Mr. Christopher, 22 years is a long time," Sarah began, her serene voice contrasting with the visible panic of the man before her. "A long time to observe, to listen, to store information." Christopher tried to focus on reading the document, but his hands trembled so much he could barely hold the paper. His pupils dilated when he reached the clause mentioning Alpha Dynamics, a company that had been absorbed by his firm years ago. "You can't prove anything," he exclaimed, but his voice came out as a desperate shout. "Actually, I can," Sarah replied, pulling a leather folder from her purse. "Every Thursday, at 8:30 in the morning, you received calls from Mr. Arthur Harrison. Remember him?" The name hit Christopher like a punch to the stomach. Arthur Harrison had been the creative director of Alpha Dynamics, a brilliant man who had developed a revolutionary inventory management system that transformed the entire industry. "I always arrived early to organize your appointments," Sarah continued, "and during those calls, I heard interesting things." "Very interesting." Martha approached discreetly, her curiosity overriding protocol. In decades of work, she had never seen Christopher Sterling in that state. The man who terrorized employees was completely out of control. Christopher began frantically flipping through the documents Sarah had placed on the desk. They were copies of emails, transcribed recordings, photographs of documents. Each page revealed a piece of a puzzle he thought he had destroyed forever. "Where did you get all this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember when you installed that recording system in your office?" Sarah smiled for the first time in years. "You said it was to protect the company from dishonest employees. Ironic, isn't it?" The memory hit Christopher like an avalanche. 5 years ago, he had ordered a discreet recording system installed in his office, paranoid about possible information leaks. He never imagined his own confessions would end up on tape. You didn't have access to those recordings, he protested. Yes, I did, Sarah replied calmly. As your executive assistant, I was responsible for organizing all the company's digital files, including the automatic backups of the security system. Martha pulled up a chair and sat down as well, fascinated by the revelation. Slowly, she began to understand the magnitude of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a termination, it was the exposure of something much bigger. Christopher tried to stand up again, but a wave of dizziness sent him collapsing back into his chair. His breathing was rapid and uneven. The termination document fell from his hands, scattering pages across the marble floor. "Where is Arthur Harrison now?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying an authority she had never displayed before. I don't know," Christopher lied, but his expression gave him away completely. "He lives in a modest little house in Queens, New York City," Sarah said. "He gets by on a tiny pension, working as a freelance consultant. At 71 years old, he still has to work because he never received a single cent for the rights to his creation." The room fell into absolute silence. Only the sound of the air conditioning and Christopher's heavy breathing filled the space. Martha looked back and forth between Sarah and her boss, trying to process all the information. How did you find him?" Christopher asked, his voice faltering. "It was easy," Sarah replied. "You mentioned his name several times during your phone calls. A little internet research, a few phone calls, and I located him. Impressive man, you know. Even after everything he's been through, he holds no grudges." Christopher tried to open the drawer of his desk, probably looking for some medication, but his hands were trembling so badly he couldn't even grip the handle properly. Sweat dripped down his face, staining his immaculate white shirt. What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Justice," Sarah replied simply. 22 years of humiliation, of psychological abuse, of being treated like garbage, but above all justice for Mr. Arthur and for every employee you've trampled over the years." Sarah opened her briefcase again and pulled out more documents. They were contracts, technical specifications, correspondence. The entire history of the misappropriation of the system created by Arthur Harrison was there, meticulously documented. "Do you know what your mistake was, Mr. Christopher?" she asked, organizing the papers methodically. "You underestimated me. All these years you thought I was just some stupid, submissive employee. You never bothered to find out that I had taken business administration courses, that I understood contracts and copyright law perfectly." Martha leaned forward, her attention completely focused on the conversation. As the HR department secretary, she knew every employee's history. She remembered perfectly when Sarah had been hired, still very young, and how she had always shown above-average intelligence. "You were always too smart for the position you held," Martha commented, speaking for the first time since she'd arrived. "I always wondered why you were never promoted." Christopher shot a furious look at Martha, but he didn't have the strength to scold her. His world was crumbling before his eyes, and he knew any wrong move could make his situation even worse. "The clause you signed is quite specific," Sarah continued, taking back the termination document. "By signing this paper, you are officially acknowledging that you improperly appropriated the Alpha 7 system, developed by Arthur Harrison in 1998. You are agreeing to return all profits obtained through this fraud, with monetary correction and interest." "This is blackmail," Christopher exclaimed, trying to reclaim a bit of his former authority. "No, this is consequence," Sarah corrected. "Blackmail would be if I were asking for something in exchange for my silence. But I don't want your silence. I want everything to come to light." Christopher finally managed to open the drawer and pulled out a bottle of blood pressure medication. His hands were trembling so much that several pills fell to the floor when he tried to open the bottle. I need to call my lawyer," he muttered. "Go ahead and call," Sarah agreed. "But first, you might want to know who else is aware of this situation." The panic in Christopher's eyes intensified. He had signed the papers thinking he was simply getting rid of a troublesome employee. Now he realized he had fallen into a carefully planned trap. "Dr. Julian Vance from Vance & Partners has already reviewed all the documents," Sarah informed him. "He confirmed that everything is perfectly legal and that you have no way to contest your own signature. Julian Vance was one of the most respected lawyers in the city, known for his irreproachable ethics. If he had endorsed those documents, it meant everything was truly solid on legal grounds. "How did you pay his fees?" Christopher asked, still trying to find a loophole. "I didn't," Sarah replied with a smile. "When I showed him what had happened to Mr. Arthur, when he saw the evidence of the fraud, he offered to work pro bono. Apparently he knew Mr. Arthur from college and had always admired his work." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Martha stood up and walked to the window, watching the street activity down below. The city was going about its normal routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that office. She was beginning to understand that she wasn't just witnessing a termination, but a historic moment for the company. "How long have you been planning all of this?" Martha asked, turning to Sarah. "Actually, it wasn't a plan," Sarah answered honestly. "For years, I just kept information out of instinct for self-preservation. But when I found out Mr. Arthur was still alive and in financial trouble, I knew I had to do something." Christopher managed to take his medication and took a few deep breaths, trying to regain control. But his face remained pale and sweaty. He picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed his personal lawyer's number. "Mr. Douglas, this is Christopher Sterling. Yes, I know it's Saturday, but this is an emergency. I need you to come to my office right now." While Christopher nervously spoke on the phone, Sarah calmly organized all the documents back into her folder. Every movement she made showed a confidence that contrasted drastically with the desperation of the man beside her. "He's coming," said Christopher, hanging up the phone. "But you won't be able to prove anything. It's just your word against mine." Sarah took a small digital recorder from her purse and placed it on the table. The tiny device had been on during the entire conversation, recording every word, every involuntary confession. "It's not just my word," she said calmly. "And besides, there are more people involved in this story than you imagine." The intercom on the desk buzzed. Christopher answered with a trembling voice. "Mr. Christopher." It was Janet's voice, the receptionist. "There are some people here wanting to speak with you. They say it's about Mr. Arthur Harrison." Christopher looked at Sarah with an expression of absolute terror. She had orchestrated everything down to the smallest detail, and he was completely cornered. "Send them up," said Sarah, answering for Christopher, who seemed to have lost the ability to speak. A few minutes later, the office door opened. An elderly man walked in, with white hair and an elegant bearing, leaning on a cane. His blue eyes shone with a vivid intelligence that even age hadn't diminished. It was Arthur Harrison. Behind him came a woman of about 40, with dark hair and features that clearly indicated she was related to the elderly man. Her brown eyes observed the room with curiosity and determination. "Mr. Christopher Sterling," said Arthur, his voice steady despite his age. "After 26 years, we finally meet in person." Christopher tried to stand up, but his legs gave way again. The presence of Arthur Harrison in his office was the materialization of his worst nightmare. The man he had robbed and tried to erase from history was there, alive and aware of everything. "This is my daughter, Abigail Harrison," continued Arthur. "She's a lawyer specializing in intellectual property." Abigail stepped forward and placed a folder on the table next to Sarah's documents. Her movements were precise and professional, showing years of courtroom experience. "Mr. Christopher," said Abigail with a firm voice, "I've come to formalize the request for restitution of the copyright for the Alpha 7 system, developed by my father and improperly appropriated by your company." Martha watched everything with growing fascination. In more than 3 decades of working in HR, she had never witnessed anything like this. It was like watching a movie, but with the added tension of knowing it was all real. Christopher tried to drink water, but his hands were trembling so much that he spilled half the glass on himself. His white shirt was now stained and wrinkled, his tie was crooked, and his hair, once perfectly combed, was disheveled. I have rights too," he muttered, trying to find some defense. "Of course you do," agreed Arthur calmly. "You have the right to hire a lawyer to contest it in court, to present your version of the facts. But we also have our rights, and the evidence Sarah collected is quite convincing. Sarah felt moved hearing Mr. Arthur use her first name with such respect. During weeks of phone conversations, she had developed a genuine admiration for the elderly man, who maintained his dignity despite everything he had been through. "How did you find out about the recordings?" Christopher asked Arthur. "I didn't," replied the elderly man. "Sarah told me everything. She came to me 3 months ago, explained the whole situation, showed me the evidence. At first, I confess I was skeptical. So many years had passed that I had already lost hope that the truth would come to light." Abigail opened her briefcase and began organizing documents on the table. They were petitions, motions, certificates, all the legal arsenal needed to move the case forward. "Mr. Christopher," she said, "you have 2 options. We can resolve this matter amicably, acknowledging the error and settling accounts with my father, or we can take everything to court and make every detail of this fraud public." "This is blackmail," Christopher repeated, but his voice sounded weaker and weaker. "It's not blackmail," Abigail corrected patiently. "It's a settlement proposal. The difference is that in blackmail, a person is coerced into doing something against their will. Here we're offering a chance to resolve an injustice in a civilized manner." The phone rang again. Christopher answered automatically, still in a state of shock. "Mr. Christopher?" It was Janet again. "More people have arrived wanting to speak with you. There are several company employees." Sarah and Arthur exchanged a knowing glance. She had shared the story with some trusted colleagues, who in turn had told others. The news that someone was finally standing up to Christopher Sterling had spread like wildfire. "How many people are there?" Christopher asked, his voice weak. "About 15, sir. Maybe more. More are arriving." Christopher hung up the phone and rested his head in his hands. His company, his empire, everything was falling apart. And the worst part was knowing that he himself had caused it all with years of abuse and arrogance. "Why are you doing this to me?" he asked in a desperate attempt to arouse compassion. "We're not doing anything against you," Arthur replied with surprising serenity. "We're just seeking justice. For 26 years I wondered why my creation had vanished, why I never received recognition or compensation. Now I know." Sarah got up and went to the window, watching the activity in the reception area downstairs. There really was a small crowd of employees waiting. People who had been humiliated, mistreated, and taken advantage of over the years stood there united by a common feeling of injustice. "You know what impresses me most, Mr. Christopher," she said, still looking out the window. "It's that, during all these years, you could have been a respected and admired boss. You had a prosperous company, dedicated employees, an enviable position in society. But you chose the path of cruelty." Martha approached Sarah at the window. She could also see the movement downstairs, and she recognized several familiar faces. They were people from different departments, different ages, united by the shared experience of having worked under the tyrannical command of Christopher Sterling. "It's remarkable how one person can affect so many lives," Martha commented thoughtfully. "How many people left the company because of him? How many developed health problems from the stress? How many families were harmed?" Abigail finished organizing her documents and closed her briefcase. Her expression was serious, but there was no anger in her eyes. As an experienced lawyer, she had learned to separate personal emotions from professional matters. "Mr. Christopher," she said, "let me be very clear about our proposal. Public acknowledgement that the Alpha 7 system was created by my father. Restitution of all profits obtained from the unauthorized use of his creation, with monetary adjustment since 1998, and implementation of a reparation program for employees who suffered workplace bullying under your management." "This will bankrupt the company," Christopher protested. "Not necessarily," Abigail replied calmly. "Your company is profitable, it has a healthy cash flow. A payment plan will be necessary, perhaps selling some non-essential assets, but the company can survive." Arthur approached the table and sat in the chair next to Sarah. His movements were slow but steady, revealing the dignity he had maintained through decades of adversity. "Christopher," he said, using his first name for the first time, "I don't want to destroy your life. I only want recognition of what is rightfully mine. And above all, I want this to serve as an example so that other people don't have to go through what I went through." The intercom rang once more. Christopher stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake, afraid to answer. "Mr. Christopher," Janet's voice was clearly nervous, "a lawyer has arrived, Mr. Douglas Rhodes. But there are also some reporters wanting to speak with you." "Reporters?" Christopher nearly shouted. "What do you mean, reporters?" Sarah and Abigail exchanged a glance. Neither of them had contacted the press directly, but in a city like New York City, news involving prominent business figures spread quickly. "Someone probably leaked the information," said Abigail. "It wasn't our intention, but it's not something we can control either." The door opened and a man of about 50 walked in, bald, wearing an impeccable grey suit. It was Douglas Rhodes, Christopher's personal attorney for over 15 years. "Christopher, what the hell is going on here?" asked Douglas, observing the scene with experienced eyes. "There's a crowd downstairs, reporters, employees. It looks like a circus." Christopher tried to explain the situation, but his words came out rushed and confused. Douglas picked up the termination documents and examined them carefully, his eyes widening as he read the clauses. "Christopher, you signed this?" asked Douglas, incredulous. I didn't read it properly. I thought it was just a standard termination," Christopher stammered. Douglas turned to Abigail, immediately recognizing a fellow professional. His experienced gaze quickly assessed the documents spread across the table. "Counselor, may I see your credentials?" he asked politely. Abigail handed over her State Bar Association card without hesitation. Douglas examined the document and then looked again at the papers on the table. His expression gradually shifted from distrust to professional concern. "Counselor Harrison," he said after a few minutes, "may I have a private conversation with my client?" "Of course," Abigail agreed, "but I want to make it clear that our settlement proposal has a set deadline, by the end of business on Monday." Sarah stood up to leave, but Arthur gently held her by the arm. "You should stay," he said. "After all, without you, none of this would have been possible." "Mr. Arthur is right," Martha agreed. "As a company employee, you have the right to be present during negotiations that involve your professional future." Douglas looked at Christopher, awaiting a decision. The businessman was clearly in no condition to think clearly. His eyes darted nervously from one person to another like a cornered animal. "Fine," Christopher murmured finally. "Everyone can stay." Douglas sat down beside his client and began meticulously examining all the documents. His experience in corporate law helped him quickly understand the legal implications of each piece of evidence. "Christopher," he said, after long minutes of silence, "I need to be frank with you. This evidence is devastating. The recordings, the emails, the original documents. This is a very well-documented case." "But there must be something we can do," Christopher protested. "Some legal loophole, some procedural error." "Unfortunately, I don't see any," Douglas answered honestly. "And even if there were, a prolonged lawsuit would only bring more public exposure and damage to your reputation." Arthur observed the conversation in silence, his hands resting on his cane. There was a serenity in his posture that contrasted with the agitation of everyone else in the room. It was as if he had already made peace with the past and was simply waiting for justice to take its course. "Mr. Douglas," said Abigail, "it might be useful to explain exactly what we're proposing. This isn't about vengeful punishment, but fair restitution." She opened her briefcase once more and pulled out a detailed document, which she handed to Douglas for review. It was a complete settlement proposal, with calculated amounts, payment schedules, and specific terms. "Public acknowledgement can be made through an official company statement," Abigail explained. "It doesn't need to be a media spectacle. As for financial restitution, we've calculated a total of $2,400,000, including monetary correction and interest." Christopher choked when he heard the amount. It was a significant sum, but not impossible for someone with his assets. The problem wasn't just the money, but what that payment represented, the public acknowledgement of his dishonesty. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us, who are just starting out. Now continuing. "And what about the employee reparations program?" asked Douglas. "It would be a $500,000 fund," Abigail replied, "managed by an independent committee to compensate employees who have suffered proven workplace harassment. Not necessarily only from Mr. Christopher's management, but from any situation of abuse within the company." Sarah felt a lump in her throat when she heard that proposal. For years she had dreamed of some form of justice, but she never imagined it could benefit other employees as well. It was as if all the suffering she had gone through could be turned into something positive. "It's a reasonable proposal," Douglas admitted after examining all the details. "Considering the strength of the evidence and the public exposure a lawsuit would bring, maybe it's better to negotiate." The phone rang once more. This time Martha answered, sparing Christopher another dose of stress. "Mr. Christopher, it's Mrs. Eleanor," she said, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Your wife. She's worried because she saw reporters in front of the company building." Christopher closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Eleanor had been married to him for 28 years and had always believed that the company's success had been achieved through honest work and competence. Discovering the truth would be devastating for her. "Tell her I'll call back later," he murmured. Martha relayed the message and hung up. Everyone in the room could tell that the situation was becoming more and more complicated for Christopher. It wasn't just a professional matter, but a personal and family one as well. "Mr. Christopher," said Arthur gently, "I know this is a difficult moment for you. I take no pleasure in seeing you suffer, but for 26 years I suffered too. I lived with the bitterness of knowing that my creation had disappeared, that all my work had been in vain." "You don't understand," Christopher protested. "Back then, everything was different. The rules weren't so clear. I was just trying to save the company." "The rules were always clear," Arthur replied firmly. "Stealing is stealing, regardless of the time or the circumstances. What I created was mine, and it should have been respected as such." Abigail checked her watch and jotted down a few notes in her planner. As an experienced attorney, she knew the importance of maintaining proper timelines and pressure during negotiations. "Mr. Douglas," she said, "I'd like to remind you that our proposal expires on Monday. After that date, our only option will be to proceed with a full lawsuit." "And would that include a claim for emotional damages?" asked Douglas. "Certainly," Abigail confirmed. "And considering my father's age and the years of injustice he suffered, the amounts would be substantially higher than what's proposed in this agreement." Sarah watched the negotiation with fascination. For years, she had been nothing more than a passive spectator at important meetings in the company. Now, for the first time, she was at the center of a decision that would change the course of several lives. "May I ask a personal question?" said Martha, addressing Sarah. "Why did you decide to stay at the company all those years, if you suffered so much?" It was a question Sarah had asked herself thousands of times. The answer wasn't simple. It involved complex financial, family, and emotional matters. "In the beginning, I needed the job," she answered honestly. "I was young, inexperienced, and the salary was good. Then, as the years went by, I developed a kind of stubbornness. I didn't want him to have the satisfaction of watching me give up." "And did you always know about Mr. Arthur's situation?" asked Martha. "Not completely," admitted Sarah. "I knew something was wrong, that information was being hidden, but I only managed to piece everything together a few months ago when I started researching more deeply." Arthur leaned forward in his chair, resting on his cane. His eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and admiration as he looked at Sarah. "You know what impresses me most about Sarah," he said. "It's that she didn't do this out of personal interest. When she came to me, she made it very clear she didn't want anything for herself. She just wanted the truth to be revealed." "Actually," Sarah corrected, "I did want something for myself. I wanted to get my dignity back. I wanted to be able to look in the mirror in the morning and respect myself again." Christopher lifted his head and looked at Sarah for the first time in a long while. There was something different in his gaze, as if he were truly seeing her as a person, not just as a subordinate. "You were always intelligent," he murmured. "I knew that. Maybe that's why I treated you badly. Because I knew you were capable of uncovering things." It was the first time in 22 years that Christopher had shown any form of recognition for Sarah's abilities. Ironically, that confession came at the very moment she was leaving the company for good. Douglas finished reviewing all the documents and turned to Christopher with a serious expression. "Christopher, my professional recommendation is to accept the settlement," he said. "The evidence is solid, the case is well-founded, and the offer is reasonable given the circumstances." "But it will mean the end of my reputation," Christopher protested. "Your reputation is already compromised," Douglas replied bluntly. "With the reporters downstairs and the employees making a fuss, this story is going to leak anyway. At least this way you have control over the narrative." The intercom buzzed again. This time it was urgent. "Mr. Christopher?" Janet's voice was clearly agitated. "Mrs. Eleanor is here and wants to come up. She's very upset because of the reporters." Christopher squeezed his eyes shut. The moment he had feared most had arrived. He would have to explain to his wife in front of everyone what had really happened all those years ago. "Send her up," he said in a weak voice. A few minutes later, the door opened, and an elegant woman of about 50 walked in. Eleanor Sterling wore an expensive designer suit. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she carried an Italian leather handbag, but her face showed worry and confusion. "Christopher, what's going on?" she asked, looking at all the people in the room. "There are reporters at the building entrance, employees holding a protest. What have they done to you?" Christopher tried to stand up to greet his wife, but his legs were still weak. Eleanor immediately sensed that something was very wrong. She had known her husband for decades and had never seen him in such a state. "Eleanor," he said with a trembling voice, "I need to tell you something. Something that happened a long time ago, before you ever met me." Arthur rose politely from his chair, leaning on his cane. His gentle demeanor contrasted with the tension in the room. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said respectfully, "I'm Arthur Harrison. I'm sorry our first meeting has to be under such difficult circumstances." Eleanor looked at the elderly man with curiosity. There was something familiar about that name, but she couldn't quite recall what it was. "Harrison," she murmured. "That name, I've heard it somewhere before." "You've probably heard your husband mention it," said Abigail, introducing herself. "I'm Abigail Harrison, Arthur's daughter and an attorney. We're here to resolve a matter that has been dragging on for 26 years. Eleanor sat down in an empty chair, realizing the situation was more serious than she had imagined. Her gaze passed over each person in the room, trying to understand what was happening. "Christopher," she said firmly, "stop stalling and explain everything to me." It was then that Christopher, with a faltering voice and frequent pauses, began to tell the whole story. The appropriation of the Alpha 7 system, the connections to Arthur, the years of cover-up. Each word was like a painful confession, torn from his throat against his will. Eleanor listened to it all in silence, her face passing through different expressions: confusion, disbelief, disappointment, and finally, a deep sadness. When Christopher finished, the room fell into absolute silence. 28 years of marriage, Eleanor finally murmured, and I knew nothing about any of this. "I wanted to protect you," Christopher said desperately. "It was something from the past. I thought it would never come to light." "Protect me?" Eleanor stood up, her voice beginning to rise. "Or protect yourself. Our entire life was built on a lie, Christopher. Our home, the trips, the children's education, it all came from stolen money." Sarah felt uncomfortable witnessing that family argument, but she knew it was important for Eleanor to understand the full scope of the situation. After all, she too was a victim, even if indirectly, of Christopher's dishonesty. "Mrs. Eleanor," Arthur said softly, "I know it's hard to hear all of this, but I want you to know that I hold no grudge against you or your family. You didn't know what had happened." Eleanor turned to the elderly man. Her eyes filled with tears. There was a dignity about him that impressed her, especially considering everything he had been through. "How can you be so generous?" she asked. "After so many years of injustice, how can you not feel anger?" "Because anger is a poison that poisons the one who carries it," Arthur replied. "For many years I carried bitterness and resentment, but I learned that it only did me harm. Now I want only justice, not revenge." Abigail approached Eleanor and offered her a tissue. As an attorney, she had dealt with many difficult family situations and understood the importance of showing empathy. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said, "I understand it's hard to process all of this, but I want you to know that our intention is not to destroy your family. We simply want to repair a historical injustice." Eleanor wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She was a strong woman, accustomed to handling complex social situations, but nothing had prepared her for this. "What exactly do you want?" she asked, addressing Abigail. "Public recognition of my father's authorship of the system," Abigail explained. "Restitution of the amounts obtained from the unauthorized use of his creation, and the establishment of a fund to compensate employees who suffered workplace harassment at the company." Helena turned to her husband, who was leaning on the table with his head in his hands. "Christopher, is it possible to pay these amounts without bankrupting the company?" Douglas answered, before Christopher had a chance. "Yes, it is," he said. "We'll need to make some adjustments, perhaps sell some assets, but the company can survive." "Then accept it," Helena said without hesitation. "Pay everything you owe and put an end to this whole story." Christopher raised his head and looked at his wife in surprise. He had expected unconditional support from her, not additional pressure to accept the settlement. "Helena, you don't understand," he protested. "This will destroy our social reputation. We'll be cut off from every circle we move in." "Good!" exclaimed Helena with a bitterness that surprised everyone, "because those circles were won with stolen money. I don't want any part of that if it was obtained dishonestly." Helena's reaction brought an awkward silence to the room. It was clear that Christopher's marriage had been deeply shaken by the revelation, and that the consequences would go far beyond the financial and legal aspects. Martha watched everything with a mixture of fascination and sadness. In decades of working in human resources, she had seen many business families go through crises, but few with the emotional intensity of that situation. "Mr. Christopher," said Abigail, checking her watch again, "it's almost 4 in the afternoon. Our offer expires on Monday, but if you want to sign today, we can settle everything this week." Sarah got up and walked to the window once more. The crowd downstairs had grown. Besides the employees and reporters, there were onlookers who had stopped to see what was happening. The story was becoming public anyway. "Mr. Arthur," she said, still looking out the window, "are you sure you want to go through all this exposure? It can be very taxing for a man of your age." Arthur joined her at the window, watching the commotion below. His eyes reflected a determination that had not faded over the years. "Sarah," he said, "for 26 years I asked myself whether it would be worth fighting, whether I would still have the strength to seek justice. Now that the opportunity has come, I will not back down." Helena approached Christopher and sat down beside him. Her initial anger had turned into a cold, calculated resolve. "Christopher," she said calmly, "you have 2 options. Sign that agreement and we try to rebuild our lives with dignity, or I take the children and leave this house today." It was a clear and direct ultimatum. Helena was not willing to keep living a lie, nor to allow her children to grow up under the shadow of unresolved dishonesty. Christopher looked at his wife in despair. In just a few hours, he had lost not only control of his company, but also the support of the most important person in his life. "Douglas," he said finally, "prepare the documents." The room fell silent for a few seconds. It was the decisive moment, the choice that would define the future of everyone present. Douglas picked up his pen and began making notes on the contracts. "Very well," said Abigail, relieved. "I'll arrange the final draft of the agreement. We can sign it today if everyone agrees." Arthur returned to his chair, leaning heavily on his cane. The emotion was beginning to weigh on him. After more than 2 decades, he would finally see his name restored and his creation recognized. "Sarah," he said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Without your courage and determination, none of this would have been possible." "It wasn't courage," Sarah replied honestly. "It was desperation. I was at the end of the line with nothing left to lose." "Sometimes," Martha commented philosophically, "you have to hit rock bottom to find the strength to climb back up." Eleanor stood up and walked to the door. "I'm going home to get the children," she said to Christopher. "When you're done here, we're going to have a very long conversation about the future of our family." She stopped at the door and turned to Arthur. "Mr. Arthur," she said, "I apologize on behalf of my family for what you went through. If I had known—" "There's no need to apologize," Arthur interrupted gently. "You had no way of knowing, and now everything is being resolved." After Eleanor left, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. Without the emotional tension of the family argument, everyone could focus on the practical aspects of the agreement. Abigail and Douglas worked together on the final draft of the documents, checking every clause, every amount, every deadline. It was meticulous work, but necessary to avoid future problems. "How long will it take to transfer the amounts?" asked Christopher, his voice still weak but more controlled. "We can divide it into monthly installments over 2 years, Abigail replied. "That will make it easier on the company's cash flow and ensure the payments are made without compromising operations." Sarah sat back down, beginning to process everything that had happened. In a few hours, her life had changed completely. She was no longer a humiliated employee, but a person who had managed to make a difference. "What are you going to do now?" asked Martha. "I don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly. "First, I'm going to rest a bit. Then maybe look for another job. Or who knows, maybe start my own business." "With the experience you have and the determination you showed today," said Arthur, "I'm sure you'll succeed at whatever you choose." The sun was beginning to set when the final documents were ready. Abigail examined them one last time, checking every detail before presenting them for signature. "Mr. Christopher," she said, "these are the final terms of the agreement. Please read them carefully before signing." This time Christopher read every word, every clause, every condition. There was no more room for misunderstandings or surprises. It was a clear, straightforward, and irreversible document. "I'm ready," he said finally. The signing was done in solemn silence. Everyone present understood the historical importance of that moment. It was the end of an injustice that had stretched on for more than 2 decades. Arthur was the last to sign, his hand trembling slightly from emotion. When he finished, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "It's done," said Abigail, collecting the signed documents. "Mr. Arthur, you will finally have the recognition you deserve." Martha stood up and walked to the window. The crowd downstairs had begun to disperse, but there were still reporters and a few curious employees waiting for news. "How are we going to announce all this?" she asked. "I'll prepare an official statement from the company," said Christopher, trying to regain some control over the situation. "Something dignified that acknowledges the mistake without getting into sensationalist details." "And I'll give a press conference," added Arthur. "People deserve to know the full truth." Sarah stood up and began gathering her personal belongings she had brought from her desk. They were few items: a mug, some photos, a calendar. 22 years of life reduced to a few small keepsakes. "Sarah," said Christopher, speaking directly to her for the first time in years, "I know it was never easy working with me. I know I was unfair to you many times." She stopped organizing her things and looked him in the eyes. There was sincerity in those words, something she had never seen in him before. "Mr. Christopher," she replied, "what happened, happened. Now we all have the chance to move forward with our lives." "Do you forgive me?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Sarah thought for a few seconds before answering. Forgiveness wasn't something she could force, but she also didn't want to hold a grudge for the rest of her life. "I'm trying," she said honestly. "It may take time, but I'm trying." Arthur approached Sarah and held her hands in his. His hands were rough and cold, but they conveyed a surprising strength. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that you changed my life. Not only because of the justice you achieved, but for showing me that there are still brave and honorable people in the world." "You also changed my life," she replied, moved. "You showed me that it's worth fighting for what is right, even when it seems impossible." Abigail finished organizing the documents in her briefcase and got ready to leave. As a lawyer, she had taken part in many important agreements, but few had moved her emotionally like that one. "Mr. Arthur," she said, "we can go." Everything is settled here. Arthur stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. His movements were careful, but there was a lightness in his steps that hadn't been there when he arrived. "Mr. Christopher," he said, addressing the businessman one last time, "I hope you find peace within yourself, and I hope you use this experience to become a better person." Christopher nodded, unable to speak. Emotion had overtaken him, and he knew he would need a long time to process everything that had happened. Martha approached Sarah and hugged her warmly. "May you find all the happiness you deserve," she said, "and thank you for allowing me to witness this historic moment." Douglas finished putting away his documents and turned to Christopher. "I'll prepare all the paperwork for the transfer of the funds," he said, "and I'll start working on the official statement to the press." One by one, everyone began leaving the office. Sarah was the last to leave, pausing at the door to take one last look at the place where she had spent more than 2 decades of her life. It was the end of a cycle, but also a new beginning. For the first time in years, she truly felt free to choose her own destiny. When they reached the ground floor, there were still a few reporters and employees waiting. Arthur addressed them with dignity, briefly explaining that the situation had been resolved amicably and that more details would be provided soon. Sarah watched from a distance as Mr. Arthur spoke with the press. There was a natural elegance about him, a moral authority that transcended his advanced age and physical limitations. It was easy to understand why he had been such a respected professional in his day. "He's impressive," remarked Martha, who had accompanied Sarah to the exit. "He's an extraordinary man," Sarah agreed. "After everything he's been through, he can still be generous and forgiving." Abigail approached them, putting away her cell phone after a conversation. "It was from the office," she explained. "They're going to prepare the entire follow-up process for the agreement. My father will finally get the recognition he deserves." The three of them stood for a few minutes watching Arthur talk to the journalists. He answered the questions with patience and clarity, without showing any bitterness or desire for revenge. He was an example of how to face adversity with dignity. "Sarah," said Abigail, "my father would like to invite you to have dinner with us tomorrow. Nothing formal, just a way to thank you for everything you've done." "It would be an honor," Sarah replied, smiling genuinely for the first time in a long while. When Arthur finished talking to the press, he rejoined the group. Despite his visible fatigue, his eyes shone with deep satisfaction. "There," he said. "Now we just have to wait for justice to take its course." They walked together to the building entrance, where a taxi was waiting to take Arthur and Abigail back home. Before getting into the car, the elderly man turned to Sarah one last time. "Sarah," he said, "promise me something. Never let anyone make you feel small again. You are an extraordinary woman, and the world needs people like you." "I promise," she replied, moved. "And you promise me you'll take care of your health and enjoy this new phase of life?" "I promise," Arthur laughed. "I have many plans for the years ahead." They said goodbye with a warm hug, and Sarah stood watching the taxi drive away into the New York City traffic. It was the end of a day that had changed all her perspectives on justice, courage, and human dignity. Martha offered Sarah a ride, and she gratefully accepted. During the drive to her place, they talked about the day's events and about how small actions can have enormous consequences. "You know you're going to become a legend at the company, right?" Martha commented. "The employee who faced the tyrannical boss and won. I hope it serves as an example for other people," Sarah replied. "So they know it's always worth fighting for what's right." When she got home, Sarah sat in her small living room and reflected on everything that had happened. Her life had changed completely in a single day, and she was still processing all the implications. The phone rang. It was Mr. Arthur. "Sarah," he said, "I forgot to ask you something important. What do you plan to do with the compensation you're going to receive?" "What compensation?" she asked, confused. "From the Employee Reparations Fund," Arthur explained. "You'll obviously be one of the main beneficiaries." Sarah hadn't thought about that. She had been so focused on getting justice for Arthur that she hadn't considered she herself would also be compensated for the suffering she had endured. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I didn't do this thinking about money." "I know," Arthur replied, "and that's exactly why you deserve every penny." They talked for a few more minutes, and Arthur repeated the invitation to dinner the following day. Sarah accepted again, eager to get to know that extraordinary man who had inspired her courage. After hanging up, Sarah went to the kitchen to make some tea. While the water boiled, she thought about her mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier. Mrs. Evelyn had always said that the truth always comes to light, no matter how long it takes. "You were right, Mum," she murmured, looking at a framed photo on the wall. The truth really did win. The following Monday, the story had already spread throughout the city. The newspapers ran headlines about the case, always highlighting the courage of an employee who had fought for justice for decades. Sarah received dozens of calls with job offers, interview requests, and even invitations to give talks. Her story had inspired many people living in similar situations of workplace abuse. But the phone call that moved her the most came from a young employee at another company. "Mrs. Sarah," said the nervous voice on the other end of the line, "my name is Megan, and I wanted to thank you for the courage you had. Because of your story, I also decided to report the abuse I suffer at my job." That was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, that her experience could pave the way for other people to find their own voices and fight for their rights. 2 weeks later, Christopher Sterling made the official announcement acknowledging Arthur Harrison as the creator of the Alpha 7 system. The company organized a simple but dignified ceremony where Arthur was officially honored. During the ceremony, Christopher personally addressed Arthur and publicly apologized for what had happened. It was an awkward moment, but necessary for the reparation process. "Mr. Arthur," said Christopher, his voice trembling with emotion, "I ask for your forgiveness for what I did. There is no justification for my actions, and I recognize the harm I caused you and your family." Arthur accepted the apologies with the same dignity he had shown throughout the entire process. His response was brief but meaningful. "I accept your apologies," he said, "and I hope this experience serves as a lesson for all of us about the importance of honesty and respect." The ceremony was covered by various media outlets, and Arthur Harrison's story became a symbol of perseverance and delayed justice. Universities began inviting him to give lectures on professional ethics and intellectual property. The reparation fund for employees was established as agreed, and Sarah was invited to participate in the committee that would evaluate the cases. It was a responsibility she accepted seriously, knowing that she could help other people who had gone through similar situations. During the following months, Sarah received several interesting job offers, but decided to accept a proposal to work as a consultant in corporate ethics. It was an opportunity to use her experience to prevent other people from going through what she had lived through. Her first client was, ironically, a company that was facing similar problems with workplace harassment. Sarah used all her knowledge and experience to help implement fairer and more respectful policies. "It's strange," she commented during a conversation with Martha, "but it seems that all the suffering I went through has a purpose now. I can use my experience to help other people." 6 months after the resolution of the case, Arthur Harrison was invited to receive an honor from the Engineers Association of New York City. It was the official recognition of his contribution to the industry, something that should have happened decades earlier. During the ceremony, Arthur gave an emotional speech about forgiveness, justice, and the importance of never giving up the fight for what is right. His words inspired hundreds of professionals present. "Injustice can last for years," he said, "but the truth is eternal, and when it finally comes to light, it illuminates not only the past, but also the future." Sarah was present at the ceremony, sitting in the front row next to Abigail. Seeing Mr. Arthur receiving the recognition he deserved was one of the most rewarding moments of her life. After the ceremony, they had dinner together at a nearby restaurant. It was a tradition they had developed, meeting regularly to talk about their projects and future plans. "Sarah," said Arthur during dinner, "I have a proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" she asked, curious. "I'm thinking about writing a book about my experience," he explained, "and I would like you to be my co-author. After all, the story wouldn't be complete without your perspective." The proposal surprised Sarah. She had never considered writing a book, but the idea of documenting that entire experience was appealing. "It would be an honor," she replied, "but I have to confess that I don't know where to start. "We start from the beginning," Arthur laughed, "and we have all the time in the world." They spent the following months working together on the book, revisiting every detail of the story, every emotion, every lesson learned. The process was therapeutic for both of them, allowing them to fully process everything that had happened. The book was published a year later with the title, "The Truth Always Wins, A Story of Courage and Justice." It quickly became a bestseller, inspiring thousands of readers across the country. During the launch tour, Sarah and Arthur visited several cities, telling their story and inspiring other people to fight for their rights. It was rewarding to see how her experience was making a difference in the lives of so many people. At one of the lectures, a young female employee approached Sarah after the presentation. "Mrs. Sarah," she said with tears in her eyes, "your story gave me the courage to report the harassment I suffer at my job. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight and win." Moments like that confirmed to Sarah that all the years of suffering had been worth it. Her pain had turned into hope for other people. 2 years after the beginning of the whole story, Christopher Sterling sought out Sarah for a conversation. They met at a discreet cafe in downtown New York City. "Sarah," he said, visibly thinner and with grayer hair, "I wanted to talk to you in person about a few things." He told her he had gone through a very difficult period after the public exposure of the case. His marriage had almost ended, he had lost several friends, and his reputation in the business world was ruined. "But you know what's strange?" he continued. "For the first time in decades, I can sleep in peace. I no longer have to carry that secret, that guilt." Sarah listened to him without judgment. She could see that he had genuinely changed, that the experience had transformed him as a person. "I started therapy," said Christopher, "and I'm learning about empathy, about how my actions have affected other people. I want to be a better person." "That's a good start," responded Sarah. "Real change takes time, but the important thing is that you're trying." They talked for over an hour, and Sarah realized she was truly able to forgive him, not for his sake, but for her own. Carrying resentment wouldn't get her anywhere. Arthur Harrison, then 74 years old, was more active than ever. In addition to the book and the lectures, he had started providing consulting for universities on intellectual property and professional ethics. "You know," he said during one of his regular meetings with Sarah, "these have been the best years of my life. Not because of the recognition or the money, but because of the feeling that I'm making a difference." Sarah completely agreed. Her new career as a business ethics consultant was flourishing, and she had found a purpose that went far beyond making money. 3 years after the case, the Employee Compensation Fund had helped more than 50 people who had suffered different types of abuse at work. Sarah coordinated the program with dedication, ensuring that each case was evaluated with care and fairness. During a committee meeting, she received an unexpected call. It was Eleanor, Christopher's ex-wife. "Sarah," said Eleanor, "I know it might seem strange for me to call, but I wanted to thank you for what you did." Eleanor told her that, after the separation, she had discovered her own strength and independence. She was working as a volunteer at an NGO that helped women who were victims of domestic violence. "Your example showed me that it's possible to face difficult situations and come out stronger," said Eleanor. "Thank you for that." It was amazing how one person's courage could create ripples that affected so many other lives in a positive way. Sarah felt honored to have been the catalyst for so many transformations. 5 years later, the company where it all began had been completely transformed. Under new management, it had implemented strict policies against workplace harassment and created a more respectful and inclusive work environment. Martha, who had retired, visited Sarah to tell her about the changes. "You can't even imagine how different it is," she said. "Employees have a voice. They're heard and respected. It's the environment it always should have been." Sarah felt gratified knowing that her fight had contributed to creating a better environment for future generations of employees. Arthur Harrison remained active at 78 years old, but with the wisdom of someone who had lived a great deal and learned from every experience. During one of his last lectures together, he shared a reflection that deeply moved Sarah. "Life taught me that justice may take time to arrive," he said, "but when it does, it brings with it not only reparation, but also redemption. Not only for those who were wronged, but for everyone involved. Sarah looked at the attentive audience and saw dozens of hopeful faces, people who were facing their own battles for justice and dignity. She knew that her story would continue inspiring other people long after she was no longer here to tell it. After the lecture, as they walked across the university campus, Arthur stopped and held Sarah's arm. "Do you know what makes me most proud in this whole story?" he asked. "Oh, you know what?" she replied. "It's that we turned our pain into hope for other people. That is the true value of everything we went through." Sarah smiled, knowing he was right. All the suffering, all the struggle, all the courage they had to gather had resulted in something far greater than themselves. They had created a legacy of justice and dignity that would continue impacting lives for generations. A few years later, when Sarah looked back on that fateful day, she walked into Christopher's office with the yellow envelope. She wondered if she would do it all over again. The answer was always the same: yes, without hesitation. Because she had learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right despite the fear. And that justice, even when it takes time to arrive, always finds a way to manifest itself through people willing to fight for it. The story of Sarah Miller and Arthur Harrison became a classic example of how an ordinary person can make a difference when they decide not to accept injustice. Their legacy would continue inspiring other people to find their own voices and fight for their rights, and it all began with a yellow envelope, a few sheets of paper, and the courage of a woman who decided that 22 years of silence were enough. End of story. Now, tell me what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Sarah made the right decision? We look forward to reading your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories.